Thanks to the speakers and Dr. Kim Sciarretta for a really fascinating discussion of the investors and regulatory microcosm of involved in developing these new health at home technologies. Our last session today is the government panel. Why is the government investing in health at home technologies? And I want to reintroduce several speakers and moderators that you've met today. So Dr. Kim Sciarretta is a branch chief here at the launch office in the Division of Research Innovation Ventures at BARDA. Then we have Dr. Dana Plude, who is the Deputy Director of the Division of Behavioral and Social Research at the National Institutes of Aging, National Institutes of Health. And of course, we have Dr. Ann Bailey with us, who's the Director of the Clinical Tech Innovation or Office of Healthcare Innovation and Learning at the Department of Veterans Affairs. So considering that today's summit is really public outreach summit, we thought that the audience might be interested in learning why these various government agencies, government entities are so interested in health at home technologies. So rather than going through kind of a list of our various funding announcements, we really wanted to paint a different picture, a picture of why does the government consider these tools so important for research and development? And so to begin that discussion, I'll ask here Kim Sciarretta to give us her view of BARDA's view towards health and home technologies, and specifically what the DRIVE division, a division of Research Innovation Ventures, is doing.
Yeah, thank you, Shayla. So BARDA's mission really is to respond to public health emergencies. So we're taking that perspective when we think of these health at home technologies. So when we think of the patient, the majority of patients are not going to seek care in a hospital for the majority of diseases that we face or common colds that we face. Most individuals will have a mild illness that can be cared for at home, although we may not know how sick they may become or what their risk is. And that's really important to think about for preparing for the future potential serious outcomes of those patients. But early intervention with these patients could really reduce those severe outcomes, reduce that hospital burden, the surges we saw early in COVID-19. And so there's this desire to think about the patients earlier in that care journey, and how we can mitigate kind of those outcomes. So, and how we can overall respond to a public health emergency in terms of wanting to reduce the morbidity and mortality and economic burden of that disease or the emergency that we're facing. So we're doing all that by thinking about technologies in this earlier space and at the home. And I mentioned in the previous session too that we're seeing this shift in patients wanting to seek that care, not going to hospitals, rural hospitals closing, patients not having primary care providers anymore, and they want to be more in control of their care. They want to seek their care where they want to and when they want to, not on their healthcare provider schedule, on their schedule. So because of that, we are interested in DRIVE, in developing technologies that can match that patient drive of what they're looking for and also help them and in the time of emergency. So we have a couple programs that I'll highlight, and you can find out more about these on our DRIVE website, drive.hhs.gov. One is actually Dr. Selimović's program, DRIVE's Lab at Home program. And this program actually seeks to develop CLIA waivable tests that have performance and quality comparable to that of a central lab. So what you would get if you went to a hospital or clinic to get your blood drawn, can we replicate that in the at-home setting to aid in clinical decision making? Then my launch office has a program called Host-Based Diagnostics. And this is really to harness our own body's response to infection to inform on our infection risk, our trajectory of infection, if we're going to deteriorate, if we need to seek that escalated care. And then lastly, we have a program called Digital Medical Countermeasures, or MCM program. And this is also Dr. Selimović's program. And the goal of this is to leverage this power of digital health tools that are coming online to empower individuals, so not just the patient, but also providers and other stakeholders in being able to rapidly respond to health security threats. And so these can be risk assessment tools or diagnostic tools that can aid in that decision making as well. Thanks. Back to you.
Thank you. And maybe just to put it in context for people on the call who may not be super well familiar with BARDA's mission, our mission here is to develop medical countermeasures, so vaccines, therapeutics, medical devices, diagnostics, et cetera, against things like chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. And so we're charged with essentially developing tools that can keep people safe in those events. And obviously, COVID-19 was an example where we had a lot to do. We were able to contribute to people's health. So that's a somewhat specialized mission, but you can clearly see, as Dr. Sciarretta here described, that even we have a really important interest in these health at home technologies that can be used in general for human health monitoring in any case, but also have a very specific role to play in our much more kind of narrow mission. Dana, would you tell us a little bit about the views of the National Institutes of Aging here?
Sure, thanks, Sheila. So, we featured in our session this morning 3 companies that we've provided seed funding to support. And it's not just NIA, the small business program cuts across all of NIH. And NIH's tagline is turning discovery into health. And obviously NIH funds tons of basic research at all different levels, going from molecular up to societal. And in my division in the National Institute on Aging, Behavioral and Social Research, we fund researchers that investigate mechanisms of change at the individual level through population level, demography, epidemiological kind of work. And so our interest in the sort of digital technology space centers in part on the idea that technology, we think, gives us potential for scaling up some of the interventions that are found to be effective, in small laboratory type studies, but which for whatever reason can't seem to get traction for scaling up to widespread usage. And so at least, technology gives us an opportunity to explore whether some of these kinds of interventions, some of which you heard about today, can actually be done at scale and in the home. And so I'm emphasizing right now our contribution in the small business space because the small business program was actually instituted, 3 decades ago by Congress, and it calls for a certain percentage of our budget to be set aside to support research and development by small businesses, which are defined as companies with fewer than 500 employees. And so these companies have difficulty, right? They don't have the research and development sections, divisions that the large companies do. And so it's a way of us being able to provide seed funding to develop these ideas and for these companies to perhaps get traction to get investors supporting their work once it's gone past that initial seed stage. The NIH Office of Small Business Research was actually rebranded, and it's now called SEED, S-E-E-D, which is Small Business Education and Entrepreneurial Development Program. So if you wanted information about what sorts of resources are available to support small businesses, you could dial up the SEED program at NIH and you'd find out about it there. And we also, in each of our institutes, has a small business program that supports these kinds of initiatives. 2 of the talks from the session earlier this morning on the patient and caregiver perspective were projects that have been supported by NIA, and then another project was supported by another one of the institutes, General Medical Sciences, if I remember correctly. So our interest is really in trying to promote technologies that will help folks, in our case, age in place. But I think, more broadly, the theme of the summit is to try to have more healthcare sort of in the home. And in the context of aging, the aging in place idea is one that you heard mentioned several times today. And I think that's where our interests lie is in terms of trying to facilitate the development of technology that can accomplish that end, and also alleviate the burden on caregivers in those situations. So in a nutshell, I would say that summarizes it. And I have lists of funding announcements, but you said we're not supposed to talk about that, so.
No, you can. Thank you, Dana. Is it fair to say then that some of these technologies might have the promise to actually delay people from having to move to a nursing home? The longer they can stay safe and protected in their own home with their own care providers, might that not mean that they might not have to move out as quickly?
Absolutely, and we actually. That's one of our goals, is to support that kind of work that allows people to, age, but age healthily. Like, it's one thing to increase lifespan, but we're about increasing health span. So what you want is a safe environment that people can live and continue to thrive within, but not be a burden to the people that are responsible for caring for them. But not only a burden, but like I think there was a nice example given earlier today about how having certain kinds of systems in one's home as an older adult alleviates anxiety on the part of children who may not be able to be with their, adult children who can't be taking care of their parents, but from a distance can kind of keep track of what's going on. So yeah, I think all of these things can help delay those kinds of moves, whether it's to nursing facilities or skilled care.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. And so, Anne, you represent the Department of Veterans Affairs here, so very kind of specific part of our population. Can you talk a little about that population's specific interest in some of these technologies?
Yeah, sure. So talk a little bit about our office and then some of the things we're doing and veteran specific focuses. I think one of the things that's unique about VA is that we do represent the end user, the healthcare system that can actually test and pilot and scale, some of these things. The largest integrated healthcare system serving 9 million veterans, and in a swarm of staff. And in the pandemic, we had the infrastructure to shift to that strong telehealth, telemedicine, remote monitoring, that type of thing. But certainly are a place where we also recognize additional opportunities. We talked about that some earlier in the provider perspective. So our Office of Healthcare Innovation and Learning has 3 areas of focus. One of those being the staff and veteran approach. So human-centered design, understanding the problem, really diving into and supporting the field. And that is the VHA innovation ecosystem. So how do we think differently about how we do things? And then once we identify opportunities, are there ways that we need to provide simulation, education, and training, evaluation to put those things into practice? And that's our SimLearn program. And then also long term, right? We know that we have stakeholders that people talk about. It takes an act of Congress to do something. Well, for us, it sometimes literally does. And so we have to think about our stakeholders both in the field and all the way up to the top of some of the federal government and leadership. And so one of the programs we have focused on that is our Center for Care and Payment Innovation. That's really thinking about transformational business and care models and care pathways. And certainly health at home fits into each of those programs, right? We want to make sure that the end user, that the veteran, that the clinician understand or recognize the problem and understand the problem and are able to articulate that so that we can innovate around what the actual problem is. I love what you're saying, Kim, about basically expanding the footprint of the healthcare system, right, into the home, augmenting our clinicians. We've talked about that some. Also, it's what people, not even as patients, it's what we've all come to expect in our own personal lives. We touch a button and we get what we need, and we know where it is in the process of coming to us, or we're given push notifications to remind us to try a new restaurant, or all these different things that have become a part of our daily life. It makes a lot of sense to embed that approach into the healthcare system and the healthcare journey as well, from the end user's perspective, the patient's perspective. And then once we know that we're solving a problem with these technologies and innovative tools, how do we train our clinicians and our staff to use them? And then once we're using them, how do we build out that care pathway? How do we build out, improve the business model? So those are some of the things we're thinking about and how we're thinking about healthcare at home and some of these technologies.
Thank you, Anne. So question for Dana and Anne here, both of you. Do you think that there might be some overlaps in your two constituencies, if you will? And I'm just thinking here, for example, about individuals with mobility difficulties, right? Maybe amputees, as well as, you know, somebody who might be elderly. So is there potential to utilize or co-develop some of the same technologies?
I will say yes. So that's one of the things that we are really interested in, is recognizing that as the end user and you know, capabilities within their healthcare system, we can't do it all, right? We shouldn't try to do it all. We need to do this in community. And so I think that early co-design, co-development, I think Dr. Zanetti mentioned that earlier as well, is really important to make sure what we get to in the end is something that integrates well across multiple healthcare systems, multiple populations of patients, whether they're veterans or not, from our perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And we support a lot of research on mobility and the environment and its impact on people in terms of their living space and how it affects them personally and socially. And there's a growing concern about social isolation in older age. That, again, I think provides an opportunity for a technological solution. Well, maybe not a total solution, but there's at least an opportunity for exploring whether, you know, keeping in touch remotely can help alleviate some of the loneliness and social isolation that's often experienced by older adults. So the fact that, you know, the mobility limitations are huge. Part of my own portfolio has to do with aging and driving, and part of aging and driving is figuring out when not to drive and when to cease driving. And for sure, having other options for mobility besides one's personal vehicle, you know, is important in making and informing those kind of decisions. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to to compare notes about what seems to be working and how we might partner up to explore some of these kinds of opportunities for examining technological and other solutions to those kind of challenges, for sure.
Thank you. So taking that concept of shared needs or common needs among different constituencies, I wanted to ask Kim here a question about offering solutions for involving different types of demographics in clinical trials. So the idea of decentralized clinical trials. Can you talk a little bit about how that could help with various needs for different, again, population groups, and what role BARDA and DRIVE are playing there?
Sure. So, as Dr. Selimović mentioned, our agency was highly involved in COVID-19 and remain involved. And we also out of DRIVE ran a program called Rapidly Deployable Capabilities, where we were trying to take technologies that existed today or in late stage development and put them out in an environment that we would hope would support care of patients that needed it. And this was mainly in these non-traditional settings. So before they went to the hospital, hoping that we could inform on their risk of infection or their health if they were deteriorating and needed escalated care. The challenge is that when conducting clinical research in that type of setting, in the setting where the technology would be utilized, and again, this is the at-home type environment, traditional CROs are not adept at handling that type of environment rapidly and responding to that. And I think there's been a trend towards trying to become more decentralized, but there are challenges with that. And so there's also, at least during COVID, there was a challenge that the priority for many of the clinical research that was being conducted was on critical medical countermeasures, the vaccines and therapeutics. And so it was difficult to test kind of some of these more novel technologies like a at-home diagnostic or a physiological monitor in the settings that they were meant to be utilized in. So again, at home, as well as collect that longitudinal data that you may need from a patient. If, for instance, if you're conducting a study on the value of these tools and informing on risk outcomes of a patient, then you're not just engaging with that patient for a single event. You're engaging with that patient through their care journey, and so you need to collect data longitudinally. And so we've seen, as we were discussing throughout this meeting today, the shift in healthcare practices, mainly demanded by COVID, but also this desire by patients to seek that care on their own terms. And so there's this opportunity right now. We see this need for clinical evaluation of technologies in the setting for which they're designed, marrying with the fact that these capabilities exist, and it's an ability to reach, as you were alluding to, Šeila, reach some populations that we may not be able to traditionally encounter in clinical study design. Because of the fact that patients have to travel distances to a clinical site, or they're hesitant in enrolling in a study. They don't want, because of the time involved, or those individual events that are needed for patient engagement versus, as I was stating before, the longitudinal time. Also, there are challenges with special groups even getting to those clinical sites. Pediatric studies, for instance, you need the care provider or the parent with the children. So if we move these clinical studies closer to the home and these environments, then we may be able to be more efficient in how we think about clinical trial design, and also be able to assess some of these technologies more rapidly when we need to. And so the desire is that if we start thinking about this, how we're conducting and engaging in decentralized healthcare right now, and that's seeking care at home, going to a community clinic or a retail clinic or retail pharmacy, could these types of, using telemedicine, right? Could these types of settings and interactions with the healthcare system be leveraged for clinical trials? And so we have an initiative around this decentralized clinical trials that we're currently conducting some market research on. But these types of technologies that we discussed today would be critical for the success of that type of model, so that you could monitor the patient in these settings and collect that data to use to be useful for the clinical trials. If we didn't have these technologies, that would create a gap, and this wouldn't really be feasible. But with these technologies and the fact that we're already seeking care in these settings, I really think this positions us for success of launching more decentralized studies. And thank you.
I wanted to just touch on a little bit more on that topic, and I think it's extremely important what you just raised about involvement or inclusion of this decentralized healthcare model. How would you take this further to ensure that we also have insights into real-world data beyond a clinical study, beyond a clinical trial? And alternatively, do you see a way for any at-home technology to be used to sort of reinvent how clinical studies are done? Are there novel insights that may be available to researchers by employing those technologies that maybe researchers just haven't been able to get otherwise?
Yeah, I think I touched on some of this, but just to be a little bit more specific. So just telemedicine capabilities right now, we're able to engage with patients on the onset of any sort of concern about infection. That can enable early enrollment and this virtual enrollment capability, recruitment and enrollment of patients. The second piece is with any sort of clinical study, you just don't want to understand the patient at time zero. It's also some time period down the road, whether it's the benefit of the therapeutic or breakthrough infections occurring from a vaccine. And that requires longitudinal engagement with the patient. It's difficult for patients sometimes to keep coming back to the same clinical site. So again, if we had technologies that could provide information on the patient's health status at home, then they wouldn't need to keep traveling to these sites. So that could be via telemedicine, that could be versus a wearable physiological monitor just measuring vital signs. There are also technologies that can draw blood at home, right? So I think we're moving in that direction where many of the lab-based requirements that were needed for clinical studies are shifting to the home, and that can be leveraged to make these types of studies feasible.
Thank you. Yes, Dana.
So I'm glad you mentioned real world data, because we just put out a funding opportunity announcement in the Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease related dementia space on using real world data platform to facilitate that kind of work that you were just talking about, and capitalizing on existing databases and forming public-private partnerships in order to have access to data that would otherwise not be available, for helping to support those kinds of initiatives where, you know, whether it's helping caregivers or people with dementia themselves, utilizing these existing data that are there for harvesting, but you know, are just not available currently. So I think the idea of accessing real world data is important, and it fits right into this idea of promoting health at home. And it also ties in with a talk earlier today on the use of artificial intelligence to sort of, you know, put together and analyze data, the huge amounts of data, to help us better understand the circumstances that influence people living healthily at home. And there are some resources that are available through various agencies, but we have something called the A2 Collective, which is a set of institutions that focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning, and they have resources for businesses and others to avail themselves of in terms of developing and utilizing AI for promoting health in a nutshell. So real world data, huge. And then I think combined with some of the tools that are coming into existence or already exist, has great potential for answering many of these questions. Thanks.
Dana, one quick follow-up question out of personal interest. Are some of these digital solutions that NIA might be supporting, are they at this point kind of on par with neurological tests, for example, to determine early onset dementia, Alzheimer's, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the short answer is no, they're not on a par yet, but that's the idea, is to see if there may be some signals that might be picked up on early that may be indicative of later development of dementia or other kinds of problems. It's sort of, you know, it makes me think of Robert's talk earlier about sepsis detection, right? And the algorithms that his company did develop to kind of catch this 39 hours before, you know, the symptoms emerged and would require an emergency room visit. That's sort of the parallel, only, you know, trying to do it months, weeks, years in advance rather than hours to see. But, you know, that we're supporting a lot of that kind of work. It's really still in its infancy. And one of the big challenges, and it comes back to the point you were just talking about with regard to diverse populations, a lot of the gold standards that exist for, you know, determining whether someone has dementia or not are predicated on, you know, non-representative samples that you know, the data, those gold standards may not apply to underrepresented populations that didn't, you know, have certain experiences. So there's a challenge in that space trying to identify what are the gold standards, quote unquote, that should be used now that you're moving away from a formal sort of a testing laboratory situation into using real world data that are occurring in everyday life.
Yeah, so really, really interesting and important. Thank you so much. We have time for just one quick question, and so I'll ask Anne here to maybe close out the session with this. We've heard earlier from Jen Goldsek one example of a tool, like I believe it was a smart toothbrush, that was tested with a group of veterans, I believe diabetes patients. Could you leave us here with one or two other examples of health at home technologies that the VA is currently interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we're looking at is remote temperature monitoring. We have been evaluating that for a few years now and are in the process of scaling it and making it more standard of care to help with monitoring for diabetic foot ulcers and ultimately prevention of amputation, which is an incredible goal, right, to pursue. When you know that you come into a hospital of veterans and you think that the amputees are related to combat, they may be, but it also may be related to diabetic foot ulcers. So we want to pay attention to those kinds of things, and remote temperature monitoring is one of the ways that we can do that. Another one that I get really excited about, you guys know this, and I could talk about it for hours and hours, is virtual reality and the ability to extend the healthcare system into the home, whether it be for at-home physical and occupational therapy, where the patient is able to be assigned exercises and then side by side with an avatar, or have very objective measures that can then be sent back to the provider in a dashboard. Could be done in real time with a provider picture in picture, or looking like they're across the table when actually obviously they're in a clinic space far away. But also mindfulness, relaxation, pain management, things like that we know that we can do remotely by providing these devices. So those are some things that we're really excited about.
Thank you, and this is some really exciting, important work, really fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk about it, but alas, we're at 3:30. So it's time to conclude this session and this summit. And I really wish to thank all of the speakers today, really fantastic contributions today, especially Drs. Disbrow and Vega and Patel for their opening remarks. Thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for your interest today, for sticking with us through 3:30 p.m. And for your engagement. We received a lot of inquiries in our resource inbox, which I think is a great indicator of how important this topic is to you. So we really appreciate that. And last but certainly not least, I wish to thank my co-organizers who are still here on the panel. Dana Plude from NIA, Kim Sciarretta here from BARDA Drive, and Ann Bailey from the VA. This was truly an interagency or federal event, and I'm very, very grateful for your and your agency's support. So with that, thank you so much for your attention. If anybody has any further questions about the event or any of the speakers, feel free to email us again at fedsummit@hhs.gov. And with that, we'll conclude today's meeting. Thank you so much.